Hi, welcome to this webinar, Summer Fundraising Level Up from the Nonprofit Coach. I'm Elizabeth Finlayson, and I am the CEO and lead coach of the Nonprofit Coach. Our mission is to create a fairer, more equitable world filled with empathy and beauty. And we do this by supporting our nonprofit clients with strategic planning, fundraising, board training, and more. These are some of the services that we offer. One of the great entryways into getting services from the Nonprofit Coach team is just through coaching, because it's just about an hour a month or a little bit more, and allows you to get best practices throughout the entire year as you're moving forward. But we also do capital campaigns, grant writing, strategic planning, marketing services. We have an online grant writing course, and of course we do these free webinars. So just to give you a little bit more context about what these are created out of the pandemic with the idea that we knew that nonprofits were going to be struggling during that time, and we want to get as much high quality information out there as quickly as possible. And they really grew from there. We usually do a general topic overview or a deep dive into a specific slice of a broader topic. We often have guest speakers. And I will say you're lucky that you're in on this one because we're only doing a couple more before we break for the summer. And then we'll come back with a new series. So let's get into our topic for today, summer fundraising. Do you know how to get the most out of your fundraising summer? I think personally that this is an interesting question because for most of the nonprofits that I've worked with or for, summer ends up being a slowdown time. That's not true of every nonprofit. If you have a nonprofit that actually has an intensive programming time during the summer, I think the information here is relevant, but you probably want to move it to a time of year, maybe just after that big push, sometimes where there's maybe a dip in the programmatic work. But either way, some of this information is really relevant to where your donors are at or your donor prospects are at during this time of year. So you might be really busy, you might be in the middle of a lot of things, but your donors, their brain is somewhere else. And so we want to make sure we're acknowledging where our donors are at and that our fundraising matches them. So what characterizes summer fundraising? So usually there is a slowdown in giving. Some organizations may have a different giving pattern, but it is typical that there's a slowdown in giving, to the point where I know that some savvy nonprofits that I've worked with, they actually have mechanisms in place for releasing funds back into their general operating during those summer months when they know they're not going to be getting a lot of income. So it could be maybe they've saved up a little bit during the year, maybe they've done a lot of their fundraising and they know that they have to keep some dollars going through that summer when there's less income coming in. That's one of the things that's typical in the summer. It's often harder to get donors' attention as they're traveling and engaging in outdoor activities. Some of this is maybe truer with now the pandemic, is maybe your donors actually started going away in the spring, not knowing when they're going to get a chance to do that again. Or maybe people are taking multiple trips. Before, we saw that people were really reticent to do in-person events, and now people want to get together and socialize before things shut down again or before that next country they're going to. So people are very interested in socializing right now, even more so than the typical summer. You might be going through a change in your fiscal year. So if you're an organization that has a July 1st or August 1st or September 1st changeover, you might be doing some things administratively that other organizations are not doing, and that does need to be attended to as well. If you have some type of programming year that fits in with the academic year, or maybe arts programming will often go through the cooler months if you're in the part of the world that does cooler months in the fall through the spring, then you may be preparing for a new programming year during the summer. So that's the other thing that can sometimes characterize that summer slowdown, is the programming is maybe more oriented to other times of the year. So these are all things that go into how our summer works on the nonprofit side. So I think a question that I get asked a lot is summer a good time to ask? I'm going to be one of those really annoying consultants that said something like, it depends. But I promise to qualify that with more information. I mentioned it's hard to get donors' attention in the summer. So we want to think about what are the best ways to do that during the warm months. Individual giving campaigns, those big pushes over email, I still think you should do one. I actually really think you should do some kind of fundraising push every quarter. But you just need to know you're not going to get as much response during the summer as during a different part of the year. It doesn't mean don't do it, but just as you're budgeting and thinking through your fundraising, you might be doing it a little bit more in order to engage your donors or keep that donor habit going on than it is about the actual dollars at that time. Okay, so what are the ways that we can be connecting with donors during this time? So one thing is having events, right? People are interested in being outside. I'm working with an organization right now that's planning something on the lake with water, outdoors. So definitely something that's going to be a lot of fun. And we were concerned about getting the right number of RSVPs, and actually we're at 84%, and the invitation's only been out a week. So to me, that's a good sign that people are interested in engaging in that outdoor time. Again, if that fits the weather patterns of where you're at. So that intersects with the donor's interest in being outside and having fun. That's the other thing, is donors are thinking more about fun at this time of year. People are a little bit more frivolous. And as you've also said, socialization's been missing now for a couple of years. So people are really interested in that. But this is what I think is actually really critical, is this relationship building part. So while you may have a hard time getting the attention of a lot of donors because they have different travel schedules, one-on-ones with donors are great during this time, because if they're in town and you can get in contact with them, they are interested in socializing with you and with your organization and are willing to meet one-on-one. It might also be the only time of year in which you have more time to meet with a lot of donors one-on-one. So this is a good time to meet someone outdoors for a coffee or for a lunch. It's also a really good time to make thank you calls. But I really like to look at my summer as, when I go into it, I think, in what ways this quarter going to forward my fundraising? It's probably not going to be because we brought in a certain number of dollars. It's probably not going to be characterized by some large asks. It might be if that fits the timing of your donor. But for the most part, you're going to need to be thinking about, how am I moving the relationships forward during this time of year? The other thing to think about, if the majority of people are making their gifts towards the year end, in that, if you're in America, in the Thanksgiving through December 31st time period, I often find if you're coming into that time of year, suddenly you realize, wow, I haven't really spoken to this donor that I want to ask for $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 since maybe this time last year or last spring. And that's going to feel really awkward when you're thinking about reapproaching them for a large gift. And so summer is a great time to pull out that list of donors and say, who do I need to meet with before the fall, so that when we come to them for an ask, it doesn't feel like we haven't spoken to them in a year. So this is where I really would love for you to be putting your focus, your time, and your energy. But your donors and your prospective donors are not the only people that you need to be thinking about for relationship building. Let's look at our board, right? Our board is critical to the way our nonprofit functions. They're often the connection to other parts of our community. We might know the programmatic part of our community very well. We might know people in other nonprofits very well. We might know our main donors very well, and maybe our board. But am I friends with every real estate agent in my area, or every lawyer, or every accountant, or whoever's on your board? No, I'm relying on my board members to get me in front of those people. And that's why summer is a great time actually for strengthening your relationship with your board. Now, we can just do those as those lunches and those coffees. I definitely recommend adding a social component so you can get to know them. But there's a little more to it when you're talking about your board. I'm often surprised when I'm working with organizations that they're not more systematic in the way they bring in their board gifts. Oops, we just moved, but I'm going to go back one slide if it's possible. I think I double clicked and then I went forward too. Just bear with me for a moment. There we go. I'm often surprised that people let their board members just make their gifts randomly. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that you're going to have a lot of control over when your board members make their gift. If they get their end of year bonus in December or even October or January, and they're going to make their gift out of that, they know that, you know that, you're going to work on that timing. But I often find that people are very passive around their board giving. And so they just kind of wait till it all shows up. And as they get close to the end of the fiscal year, they say, hey, 3 people haven't made their board gifts yet. Well, if we've talked about summer being a time when gifts get a little bit lower and maybe we might have a cash flow crunch, it is really important that we've got it figured out how much we're getting from our board. Are they meeting the requirements that you've set out as part of their board service? And when are those gifts coming in? Even if you know you're not going to get them for 6 months, just knowing how much and when. So when you meet one-on-one with your board members, this is a good time to ask for their annual gift. You know, if they gave $5,000 last year, maybe you talk to them again and say, hey, we would love your $5,000 again this year. Is that what you're expecting? Thank them for that in a way that you probably haven't all year. They probably got their letter and their email. But when you're working with your board members, you've probably talked about their contacts and the upcoming event or what the board duties are. And maybe you haven't had a chance to really just say, thank you. Thank you for being so fantastic and making this gift every year. And so if you're having that social one-on-one with them, it's a really good time to remind them that you actually are grateful for their gift, even if it's quote unquote, like they have to, they really don't, right? Bring the pledge form so they can fill it out. So if they know, yes, I'm going to pay you out of our end of year bonus in January, if they fill out the form and they tell you how much and when, you've got that all planned out. And so it's not a surprise. You're not waiting for it or hoping for it. I've definitely worked with organizations that have board members who aren't sure that board member is really going to make that gift, or they have to follow up with them a bunch of times. Why not start that process at the beginning of the year or right during the summer, get those pledge forms, and then you already know. And then the follow-up is a little bit easier because you've got it written out. They said they're going to make that $1,000 gift again because they said that they would, and now you just have to hold them to it. It's a great time to go over how they intend to fundraise for the year. We do this work all the time, so it's easy for us to know, of course, they're going to help with the event. Of course, they have to help with year end. Of course, this, but they're not thinking about that. Even if they've done it a bunch of times, just going over what the things are for the year, what the expectations are. Things are changing in their lives. They might have gotten a promotion. They might have had a baby. They might be getting divorced. They might be sending a kid to college. All of those things are going to affect how they fundraise, how much they give, and just being really personally related to where they're at is very helpful. This is also when I go over their contact list with them. So there's a few things that are part of that. One, I always ask them to bring their quote unquote Rolodex. And by that, I mean their digital Rolodex. It could be their phone. It could be a list of index cards. I don't care what it is, but bring your list of who you know. If you have that list already, I print mine off that has their name by it, and I bring it to them and I say, do these people still live in these same addresses? Do you think they're still going to be giving at these levels? Do you see anything that's changed? That's when they tell you this person's got divorced, this person's moved away, we're in a fight, all those things, right? So I get that information and I update their list, which means that I did this previously, right? And those people got put into whatever database system you're using. So if that hasn't happened, this gets to be your first one. If it has happened, print it off. But you do want to make sure that those people are getting in and that they're marked with the board member's name in some way so that you're able to account for and tell them. Say like, hey, Sheila, your 5 people, they gave this much this year. It's a great way for you to acknowledge for your board members what they've done, how they're succeeding. One of the things I think best motivates board members is when you can really cheerlead the success that's on there. Some people are going to do things, some people are not. But if you're always acknowledging the successes, that sets the standard for the other board members. Even if that standard means, hey, I don't really fit on this board anymore because I actually can't contribute in that way. That's good too. People know, doesn't mean they can't be a volunteer or can't love your organization, but the board members have to be people who are pulling the organization forward. When I go over that list with my board members, I ask them, who do you think with extra time and attention could maybe become a major donor to the organization? I remind them what that looks like. I might say at our organization, that's $1,000 and above. I know some organizations in which anything under $10,000 does not count as a major gift. That's just an everyday gift. But most organizations that I work with, 1,000 and up would be considered a major gift. So if they've got 20 people on that list and they're saying, these are the ones I want to invite to the event, and these are the ones I want to send a letter to at year end, knowing that there's one or two that could be major donors, that helps me know I'm going to invite them to one of our special, maybe cultivation events. That's when I'm going to see if we can get a coffee, just me and them, and talk about the organization and see if there's an interest there. The thing to always remember about fundraising is that it's matchmaking, right? We're not twisting anybody's arms or putting a gun to anybody's head. We're really just seeing, like, do you have an interest in this? Do you want to put your dollars towards making the world better in this particular way? I would use the example is I worked in a women's organization, a women's policy organization. I worked at a puppet theater. They were not the same donors. The puppet theater donors were not going to support the women's policy. The women's policy were not going to support the puppet theater. They all had their own particular sets of interests, and that's completely appropriate, right? So the other thing to ask, if I've got this board list and I've had it for now a couple of years and I've been having this conversation with board members, it can get really stale. So I ask them, who can be added to the list? Have you met anybody recently at a networking event? I will ask them, have you met anybody new at your job or at your children's school or at your church or synagogue? Whatever those things are. Are there new vendors in your life that you think maybe kind of owe you a favor or two? These are all people that could be donors to the organization. Another thing, if we talk about leveling up our board during the summer, is this might be a good time to host a workshop or a training for your board. If you have a governance committee, or just if you're aware that your board could use some development in some skills, this would be a great time to do it. You can actually combine that socialization component with the training. And to think about, again, as people have been missing socialization, one of the organizations I'm working with has said, you know what, we've been meeting on Zoom for 2 years. And so now, while we do have a couple of people out of state, we have new board members who literally never met some of the other board members in person. And some people have noticed, we're getting mediocre attendance over Zoom that we didn't have when we were in person. So it's time to actually do something that really shakes it up and helps people feel more connected to the organization, to the mission. And that's another thing I do want to just say while we're talking about board is that we're very focused on what they need to do to move the organization forward. At least I know that I am. But it has been a lesson I've learned a couple of times that we need to keep inspiring our board members. There's a reason that they became attracted to the work. There's something about the mission. Maybe it's the children, maybe it's the art, maybe it's whatever it is. Make sure that's getting into those board meetings. And maybe that's something you can actually just have an extra training or socialization or event for your board to reconnect them with the mission. Because otherwise, if it just starts to feel like drudgery, they can really just start to get that disengagement, sitting back a little bit, waiting for someone else to do something. And you want to remind them, this is actually important to you, right? Whether it's just a little bit at the beginning of a board meeting, whatever it is. But this is another way to think about using your summer to help your board become more engaged. All right, so this is one of my favorite things about summer, which is just crazy, but I like to work on my systems in the summer. I know systems is not everybody's thing, but those things, all right, think of your busiest fundraising time. Maybe it's before your major event or when you're in the middle of a big push, and those things that drive you crazy, like you go to call a donor and the phone number isn't there, or the name is, Mr. and Mrs. and it's got the wrong last name, whatever those things are that just make your job harder at your busiest times, those are the problems I like to solve in summer. So I have a little rule with myself when I'm in a database that every record I touch is better than when I went into it. So I may not be able to always sit down and fix all the records. And something to just know, databases are always out of sync. Somebody is moving, somebody is dying, somebody's getting divorced. That is the nature of human beings. And so something is always getting out of sync, and that's okay. But if I go in a record and I have somebody's email address and I see that it's missing from the database, I just put it in that moment. It takes a second. I do that for every record that I go in. And so I like to think that I leave a trail of cleanup behind me. But we get to summer and suddenly, hopefully you have a little bit more time if you can't do some of those big fundraising pushes as we talked about, because it's hard to get your donor attention, then doing something like running a deduplication report or query in your system. It might be a time to do a data append. You can actually get data added to your system. You can pay to get people's email addresses or get updated mailing addresses. I've worked at places where every year they would run the records through the post office and get updated addresses. So everybody who moved and had a forwarding address, all of that would go into the system. Cleaning up your list. Maybe you've got, these people are the events, or these are the volunteers, or signed up for the newsletter, and maybe those are getting out of sync. Those are great things to clean up at this time of year so you don't have a difficult time later. It might be a time to add a field to your database if you've got a flexible enough system that allows you to add fields. We just talked about if you've got a list of records from a board member, some systems have it really easy where you can just kind of put in who the solicitor is. Some of them you have to add a field or put it in through some kind of relationship. So this might be a time to say, what other information needs to be in here? I'm a really big believer in having as many systems in one place. I do not like to have a volunteer database in one thing, an advocacy database in another, programming using yet another space. Someone's got a spreadsheet over here. You really lose the full picture when that happens. If you're able to go into a record and see this person's a volunteer and they signed up for our advocacy newsletter, plus they're opening our regular newsletters, plus they made a donation, you're far better able to have a good quality conversation with that person and really make the right ask of them. If you have no idea they've been volunteering and opening emails and doing all these things, then you might just ignore that person when actually all of their behavior is showing that they're really loyal and interested in you. So under the idea of adding fields, do you need to talk to your programming staff and say, what information are you tracking on a spreadsheet or separately that we could actually put into the database? That's something that could be really helpful. This is a good time to start refreshing your templates, whether it's your thank you letters, writing welcome packets, updating your newsletter template. All of those things are really great. I mean, I would say you probably need to do them more often. But again, if we're looking at one of our slowdown seasons, going through each of your pieces. Summer is often a time when we would rewrite our grant templates as well. So we'd say, okay, for the year, this is what we're doing. These are all the things. And we'll talk a little bit more about foundations in a second. But anything that's those template documents, summer is a good time to, I'm going to admit something. Summer is a good time to get those refreshed. I thought this was really interesting as we did our research to make sure we were covering everything. That at Graphic, they said reviewing your social media mix as well. There's actually been a change. I think there's probably constantly a change in the social media that people are using, but some things are going up while others are going down. So Facebook has gone down a little bit. Traffic has increased from Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Pinterest. So it might be a good time and say, is there another channel we need to be paying a little bit more attention to? Is there a channel we need to be paying less attention to? We know with social media, it doesn't do us a lot of good to be spread over so many channels, we can't keep them up very well. It's better to pick a couple of channels and do them consistently and well than to run all over the place. But you still need to evaluate that and say, which are the channels that are really paying off for us? Where are we growing? Where are we having a following? Where is our audience? I know a few years back, Pinterest was primarily female. I don't know if that's still true, but things like that that help you know who is your audience, not just an audience. So I started to talk about your foundation strategy. So the pandemic and everything that happened in 2020 really started to shift the way foundations were responding to organizations. Some philanthropic markets are a little bit more flexible. I'm outside of Chicago. Chicago has a great philanthropic market, and the foundations were known for being a little more structured in both the best and worst ways. And what we saw in the pandemic is that foundations, which typically have longer time frames in getting money to organizations, they have a lot more paperwork, obviously, that's part of that process. They really put a lot of those things aside and said, what do people need? How do we operate quickly? And so organizations shifted, and you can see here, many of them began providing more unrestricted grant dollars. Many of them actually looked at their policy and systems change as part of the important issue, especially around advocacy and organizing. And 90% are making new efforts to support organizations serving communities disproportionately affected by public health and economic consequences of COVID-19. So they were looking at people of color, they're looking at people from lower income communities, people with disabilities, undocumented immigrants. So maybe a year or two ago, you might have had a particular way that you've approached foundations. If you've got that template language, you have ways that you've approached it. This is probably a good time and say, did that funder that we'd had our eye on for a long time, who told us no because they didn't do unrestricted, or they don't follow us, or they didn't do undocumented, maybe they've shifted their guidelines. So it's a really good time to look over those prospects and say, who has changed their guidelines and have they been updated? Do we fit now? Is it that in your template language, you might say, I need to have a paragraph now that talks about the social justice work that was always part of what we were doing, but we just never really talked about it that way with funders, or something to do with health or economic disparities. So there might be a different way that you can talk about your work that will be attractive to funders that wasn't the case a year or two ago. All right, so I think this may actually seem crazy for people, but this is actually something that makes my life so much easier when I'm on the staff side. I work on my year-end fundraising in the summer. Yes, I'm going to say that again. I work on my year-end fundraising in the summer. And you can think of it this way. What if I already said to you? I said we're cleaning up our database. I said that I'm going over the list with my board members. Who are we going to ask for what, right? We're getting that stuff in there. We're marking their name down. We are ready. We are ready for them, right? If we're having those one-on-one meetings with donors, right, that's also helping us to have those asks later on. But now, I would say as we get towards the end of summer and I'm doing that work, having a couple meetings a week, putting all those things in, it's time to start writing your year-end appeals, coming up with a theme, going over your campaign plan. This sometimes has been just like my absolute secret to success, because that time of year is so busy in fundraising that it's hard to create the themes and the actual campaign at the same time that you're writing everything. I've done it, you can do it, right? But it's just easier to do it earlier. One of the things that's really helpful about doing that is like looking at last year's fundraising successes and failures. I like to, after each campaign, actually write up. I'll have numerically what worked and didn't work. So I'll chart it out. This appeal brought in this much, had this response rate, those kind of things. I'll go through all of those pieces. But then I'll write down in little bullets or paragraphs the things that don't show up in the numbers, like we need to have more volunteer solicitors this time, or focusing on these personal stories didn't work as well as last year's campaign, or we need to start 2 weeks earlier, or the October appeals, nobody's even responding to them starting November. Whatever those things are, get them written down, because I will find that what happens when you're busy and you start to do it, you take last year's templates, last year's timelines, last year's everything, copy, save a new one, update the deadlines, and let's get going. And so if you don't review what didn't work last year, you're probably going to do it again, or at least I know I would, because I'm busy and I'm tired and I'm not thinking about what happened 12 months ago. I'm thinking about what I have to do this week and next week. So just something that I say like really does make a difference. And I absolutely love in fundraising when there's something you can say no to, like don't write that appeal, don't ask that person. Great, that's one less thing on the list, right? So get that stuff out of there, and hopefully it'll tighten up your time a little bit. So we talked about creating your year-end campaign, create a theme. So you want something that makes it all tie in together. It can just seem like a bunch of asks if you don't create some unifying concept for all the work that's done during that time. This is often when we find out, hey, we don't actually have enough stories or testimonials to do our year-end campaign. If we want to be respectful of the people whose stories we're highlighting in our work, you need a little bit more time. You need time to get their permission. You need time for them to review it. You need time in order to be declined and have somebody else come in. Also, when I look at my stories, I like to look and say, how would I feel if this story was about me? Does it sound like I'm like a horrible, oppressed person and thank God someone saved me? Or does it sound like I'm a hero in my own story? All of that takes time. We can't be thoughtful if we don't have the time to do it, because then we just have deadlines. So that's why starting early really does make a difference. Now, the enemy of starting early is the campaign that you have to do next week that you didn't start early on before. So I just want to say, if you've got a campaign next week, do that, right? Finish that, then start early for the next campaign, and then start that next one early. Every 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 months earlier you start, the better off you are. The more dollars you get in. I will specifically use the example of an event. If you fundraise for 3 months before an event, you're going to get a very different set of dollars than if you fundraise for 6 months before that event, than if you fundraise for 9 months, than if you fundraise for 12. And that's just because with that extra time, you're giving yourself to be thoughtful, and you're giving yourself time to be declined. You're giving your donors time to think about it, get to their decision makers, say yes. And the same is really true with a lot of this work. So as we get closer to sending something out, yeah, we might change something. We might throw in a couple bullets about a new program or something, but it doesn't change as much as you think it will. So it's just easier on everybody to just do it early. I write my year-end appeal. I get it approved by my executive director. I will say sometimes that's the hardest part, because they'll approve it, and then later when you go to send it, they go to re-edit again. I'm like, no, you already approved it. So that might be the hardest part. But other than that, it actually should make your life easier. And as I said, entering those names and updating those lists in the database that you've been getting from these donors, these board members, all of this along the way, right? So I hope you're hearing in this how well set up you'll be for the rest of the year getting through this summer plan. Okay, so I am going to share with you, this is just kind of a taste of the kind of work that I do with organizations or people on our team do. We offer transformational coaching like this. And when we meet for 15 to 20 hours a year, right? So just a couple of times a month, really, we work on creating a fundraising plan for the year. We create effective fundraising campaigns like a year-end campaign or a summer campaign. A lot of times we spend time problem solving professional issues that affect work. It is surprising. You can be fantastic at your job. Your coworkers can be fantastic at their job. But when those personal professional issues come up, I often find they have to relate to power differentials, like maybe it's a board member taking over somebody's spot, or somebody not being able to act to their full capacity as a fundraiser. Maybe their executive director is afraid of fundraising. Whatever those things are, we problem solve those things together so they can get out of the way and you can get back into the actual nonprofit effectiveness. And we review your systems for big improvements. We look at, I do want to tell a story about reviewing somebody's system. I was working with an organization in which the fundraiser, she's just fantastic. And she was newer to fundraising, but I think she had a very good instinct for storytelling and using image and word to really make the mission come to life. But she was feeling very discouraged because in the spring, her executive director had done a fundraising push and been very successful, and it had a capital campaign component to it, but she had raised quite a bit of money. And at year end, when we were expecting to raise a lot of money, she had raised about 10%. And she had really just done a lot of really good work. And so it was surprising. But we let that go. And I noticed that their systems really were not, the way the dollars were allocated were not very clean and tidy. And they were really, dollars had come in from multiple sources and they were just really all over the place. So you couldn't actually tell what fundraising activities were working and which ones were not. So we went through all of that. And once we actually figured it out and allocated everything to what it really came into, she had actually beaten the executive director's fundraising by $4,000. So she had actually been doing a fabulous job, which it looked like from her work, but you couldn't tell because it was all in the wrong places. And after that, I noticed she felt better about her work. There was a gain in confidence from her executive director and from the person who supervises her, and letting her handle more work because they just knew what she was doing was working. And it's something that's so simple, right? It's just like dollars in the wrong spot, but it really makes a difference in knowing what's effective and what works. And that just felt like a really great success, is helping her know what a great job she was doing. So if you would like to contact us, this is the information for the nonprofit coach team. This is our phone number, as well as our email address. And so I'm actually going to close this out, but I will stay on for people to ask questions if anybody has any last minute questions before we go. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you the best in your summer fundraising.